Welcome to Tolmie State Park. The purpose of this video is to provide some general information about the beach and its inhabitants as well as habitats to make your visit more enjoyable. The park is located several miles north of Lacey, Washington, to the base of Johnson Point on Nisqually Reach. It is composed of a forested upland with a stream that flows into a small estuary where the fresh water from the stream mixes with the salt water from Puget Sound. The estuary is protected from open water by a long, narrow spit composed of glacial gravel and cobbles washed from the hillside by the stream, as well as from nearby banks by storm waves. Water from the stream flows over the beach at low tide. The beach itself is wide and composed of slightly muddy sand with boulders and gravels in the upper part. So let's take a close-up look at the beach at low tide. This view is from the top of the spit, looking north across the beach to Nisqually Reach. The white arrow points to a person at low tide, which illustrates that the beach is very wide. Beyond is open water. The beach between the low tide and the high tide is called the intertidal zone. So let's talk a little bit about the different habitats that make up the beach. The dry gravel habitat is the light-colored horizontal strip near the bottom of the slide. It is only covered by seawater every few days or so, allowing only a few organisms to be able to live here. In addition, drying effects, waves, and currents can move the gravel, crushing animals that can't find shelter. However, there's a small animal called a beach hopper that looks like a flea that lives in the area eating material that is washed in at high tide. The wet gravel habitat is located at the base of the spit. Because it is lower on the beach, it is covered more often by the tide. In addition, when the tide is out, seawater that has infiltrated the gravel at high tide will trickle out at low tide, keeping the area wet and cool. Lots of native littleneck and manila clams are found in this area, along with attached seaweed. The sand flat habitat supports a large number of organisms. Sand is a fine-grained material that keeps the organisms moist while allowing them to burrow in its three-dimensional space for food and protection. Some of the animals, like fish and crabs, move in and out with the tide. Others, like clams, moon snails, and marine worms, live permanently under the sand. Several species, such as marine plants and the sand dollar, live on the surface of the sand. The stream habitat meanders over the surface at low tide. A few fishes can tolerate the fresh water, move up the stream, and catch prey that has been washed out of the sand. The boulder habitat is sparse on this beach. Only a few large rocks occur on the sand flat. Unlike the sand, these fine grains, whose fine grains allow organisms to burrow in a three-dimensional world, boulders are solid and only offer a two-dimensional surface. Commonly attached to the surface of boulders are barnacles, sea lettuce, and periwinkle snails. Shore crabs seek shelter from predators from underneath the boulders. Okay, now that you've been introduced to some different beach habitats, let's take a look at some of the most common and easily seen organisms that can be found in each kind of habitat. Can you spot the fish in this photograph? It's in the middle of the photograph with its head pointing toward the top. Can you see it now? The color pattern of the body allows the fish to blend with the sand background and protects it from predators. This animal is called a juvenile staghorn sculpin. It is a bottom-dwelling fish that inhabits the shallow waters of Puget Sound, but also tolerates brackish water. It moves in with the tide to feed on bottom organisms. So let's put this picture of the staghorn sculpin on the photograph of the beach, with an arrow indicating where it can be found, in this case, in the stream habitat. Here we have a photograph of a 2-inch shell of one of the common clams in the sand flat, the white Makoma clam. As you walk the beach, you will find many of these shells scattered about. Although they are typically buried well below the surface, they can be eaten by burrowing moonstales or washed out by a meandering stream and eaten by gulls, in both cases leaving their white shells on the surface of the sand. This species is typically found in the sand flats from the mid-tide level to the low tide level. The shore crab is a common inhabitant of a variety of habitats, wherever it can find a hiding place. In muddy areas, it will burrow into the sediment of the beach. In other habitats, it will hide under seaweed, cobbles, or boulders to avoid predation from fish or birds such as seagulls, crows, and the great blue herons. This species can be found under boulders or large cobbles in the upper beach. Common on the beach in the spring and summer are several colorful plants called seaweeds, attached to boulders or cobbles. There are 3 major kinds of seaweed: green, brown, and red, named for the color of their light-absorbing pigments. Seen here are 2 of the 3 kinds: a green seaweed called sea lettuce and a red seaweed called nori. Sea lettuce is sometimes collected as food, but nori is more commonly collected. In fact, nori is the main ingredient of the Japanese sandwich called sushi and is the most commonly cultured seaweed in the world. Sea lettuce and nori occur between the high and mid-tide levels. Look closely at the top and sides of boulders, and you will find 2 small shelled animals. One is a relative of crabs and shrimp that lives in a small volcano-shaped house with a door at the top. It is called a little brown barnacle, although sometimes they can be lighter in color as seen in this photograph. The dark purple shells contain a very small snail called a periwinkle. There are several species of periwinkle that occur in our area, including this one called the Sitka periwinkle. These animals can be found on large cobbles or boulders in the mid to high intertidal zone. Burrowing in the sand and gravel of the mid-intertidal zone are several species of clams. Very common are the native little neck clam, along with an introduced species, the Manila or Japanese clam. Both clams average around 1 to 2 inches in shell length and can be found several inches deep in the sediment. They are very popular with recreational diggers at Tolmie and other local parks as well. On private beaches, they are part of a large farmed shellfish industry in Puget Sound with an annual value of between $15 to $20 million. They occur in the wet gravel habitat. Dwarf eelgrass is a flowering plant that has reinvaded the marine environment, so it's not properly called a seaweed. It is another accidental import from Asia. It hitched a ride, like many other local exotic species, within crates of oysters brought from Japan before the Second World War. Unlike its much larger native eelgrass cousin, dwarf eelgrass is only 12 inches long. It occurs in small patches in the mid to upper part of the intertidal zone. Because of its small size and high location in the intertidal zone, its role in the local ecosystem is probably less than its bigger cousin, which forms large meadows in the low intertidal to subtidal zone. Dwarf eelgrass occurs on the sand flats below the wet gravel area. Native eelgrass occurs around the low tide line, further east and north around the shoreline of Puget Sound. Another member of the farmed shellfish industry in Puget Sound is the Pacific oyster. It was brought over from Japan in the 1920s and 1930s when demand for the native oyster outstripped supply. The non-native oyster does spawn here during most years, however, but oyster growers have recently begun enhancing natural spawning through the use of shellfish hatcheries. Farmed shellfish contribute around $50 to $75 million to the local economy annually. However, if neighbors do not control waste from pets or from livestock, or have leaking septic tanks and yard chemicals that flow into the water, these valuable shellfish can be killed or rendered unfit for human consumption, with significant damage to the local ecology as well as economy. Oysters are planted by the Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife for the recreational use by the public. Oysters must be shucked on the beach and the shells returned to the oyster reef, providing a place for attachment for baby oysters. Made by nature rather than by government, sand dollars are common in the mid to low intertidal zone at Tolmie. They like sandy beaches where they can burrow just under the surface of the sand, and when the tide is out, and to protect themselves from drying. When the tide returns, they'll tip themselves on their edge and grab plankton with their tube feet. They are relatives of sea stars and sea urchins and grow to 4 inches. Sand dollars occur in large groups covering the sand surface at the mid to low intertidal zone. One of several large crabs that can be found on the beach at Tolmie, the red rock crab is one of the larger species. The red rock crab can sometimes be found trying to hide under seaweed at low tide. If the day is sunny and hot, however, the crab may still suffer heat effects and die. However, what appears to be a dead crab may not be one at all. Rather, the shell may have been discarded by a crab during the process of molting. Molting is similar to what snakes do when they shed their skin, and all arthropods have to shed their shells in order to grow. The occasional red rock crab is found in the lower intertidal zone, but most commonly in subtidal, and it moves in and out with the tides. Another major predator in the intertidal zone is the moon snail. This snail is very large. It has a spiral shell that can grow to over 5 inches. It uses its rasp-like tongue to drill a hole in a clamshell, as you see in the clamshell in the photograph, and then scrape out the meat. It normally burrows under the sand, but its presence can be determined from the basket-like egg cases that litter the beach in late spring. You can see a photo of the egg case. The eggs are sandwiched between mucus and sand to form a semicircular strip. The snail is eaten by gulls, who will grab an exposed snail, fly up in the air, and then drop it on some hard ground. It breaks the shell, and the gull now has access to the flesh. The moon snail occurs in the low intertidal zone. This picture of the snail shows its large foot extended out from the shell. Another major predator on the beach is the great blue heron. A large wading bird, it stands up to 4 feet tall. It wades in the shallows or sits along some dock or afloat, where it will, with lightning speed, grab up a small fish or a crab. Interesting, it roosts in fir trees along the shoreline, where it builds its nest or spends the night. It can be found wading along the water's edge at Tolmie. So now that you're familiar with Tolmie State Park common habitats and inhabitants, take your friends and family to the park to find its hidden treasures. If you have further questions about organisms discussed on this video, or about other animals or plants or marine habitats in general, go to the website PugetSoundSeaLife.com for more information. Goodbye, and don't forget to keep your beaches clean.